Hello, everybody. My name is Caleb Hill. I was working this summer for the New England Municipal Sustainability Network on an atlas describing economic and sustainability incentives. My supervisor this summer was Dovev Levine and Gina Khan, both at the UNH Sustainability Institute, and they also wear many hats and work with the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, which I will henceforth refer to as NEMS to save myself the mouthful. So the incentives that we are studying are commonly called the split incentives problem. To boil it down to one sentence, when a tenant in a rental unit pays for heat or other energy sources, owners lose incentive to make efficiency or sustainability upgrades, use more sustainable fuels, use cleaner fuels, things like that. So, who I was doing this work for was NEMS, which I said earlier was the New England Municipal Sustainability Network. And what this is a network of around 100 communities across New England that collaborate on a variety of issues, not just the split incentives problem. And they work toward a coherent sustainability policy, um, and can learn from each other, learn what works in one municipality, what doesn't work in another municipality. So they collaborate to accelerate everybody forward towards sustainability. So the reason we're interested in the split incentives problem from a sustainability and economic perspective is that not addressing the renter population leaves a lot on the table. And what I mean by that is when we target our policies towards specifically owners, meaning subsidies and things like that are not um, provided for renters, they're provided only for owners. That leaves in New England, about a third of the population of households unaffected by these policies. So, about a third of households in New England are occupied by renters. And of that third, about 83% of those renters pay for utilities in one form or another. And of that 33%, about half, 48%, have what we classify as high rent burden. What that means is that rent is over 30% of gross monthly income for about half of those renters in New England. So, of those renter occupied structures, about two-thirds were built before 1980, and the vast majority do not use clean, sustainable fuels for heating, for instance. And we use this two-third built before 1980 as a proxy for efficiency. Not every structure built before 1980 is inefficient and poorly insulated, but it's a pretty good litmus test. And 1980 is kind of picked arbitrarily here, but older structures are less efficient. And there's a huge portion of rental structures that are quite old, which we'll see some examples of later on. So the interesting things to keep in mind are that one, most of this data does not come from the community level. This is national level census data that I've used to come up with these figures. So this is not happening at a community level. It needs to happen at a larger scale because communities often don't have the resources. Um, and we also come up against the question of what happens when energy spikes, when energy costs spike. That creates a big swath of vulnerable population in the renters. Okay, so how are we studying this problem and what are we creating? We created what we called the Split Incentives Atlas, which I'll show you a small slice of later. which takes data that is available at a national scale and provides it to specific municipalities. So, what the pipeline kind of looks like is taking mostly Census Bureau products, a little bit of Department of Energy data has also been used, but mostly Census Bureau products, and distilling it, looking at it at a variety of scales, feeding that into ArcGIS Online, which is what AGOL stands for, displaying this spatially in a map format, slicing and dicing to give communities various views of energy source, rent burden, renter population, things like that, and then handing this directly to the policymakers in NEMS so that they can use this data to make informed policy decisions. And a really important part of this, which I will digress on a little bit, is responsible use of AI, because we are using this data eventually for policy decisions. Our stakeholders need to be very confident that this data is correct, it's not hallucinated. And so the approach that we've been taking, which I think is pretty much the only way to responsibly use AI nowadays, is to have AI tools create code that we can then inspect and then use that code to grab the data that we're interested in. And so there's an inspection phase in the middle. So we're not just prompting and saying, create this report for me. We're saying, create this tool that I can inspect and then use to create this report later on. So, what does this actually look like in practice? I have an example here of three municipalities and a couple of interesting metrics that we collected. I've masked the identities of these three municipalities so that we can have a little bit more of an instructive example of the kind of things that we'd like to do. So, first of all, the individual NEMS communities would like to understand what they look like. So, like I said, most communities do not collect these metrics internally. Many of these communities don't have the resources, some of them are very small. So these data products are not available at the municipal level before somebody I went through and collected them and displayed them. So there's an inward facing aspect to this tool. There's also an outward collaborative aspect to it. These communities can now look at themselves in relation to other communities and try and ask who looks like us and what works for them, what doesn't work for them. So these three municipalities, X, Y, and Z, what I've done here is I've pulled out some charts. The upper chart in each one shows a distribution of how old rental structures are. And we don't have to look at all the different colors. The important one is this brown color. It's kind of hard to see without a magnifying glass. But this is the proportion of rental structures that were built before 1939. So, by any metric, these are old rental structures. And now on these lower charts, what we can see uh, is a distribution of number of units inside of a rental structure. So the important part here is this blue slice, which is the number of single unit rental structures. And so without knowing what these communities are, you can see that X and Y are more similar to each other than they are to Z. And so community X can look at community Y and see what has worked and what hasn't worked for them. Um, And the interesting thing about this example is that Community X is Nashua, New Hampshire. Community Y is North Berwick, Maine. Community Z is Providence, Rhode Island. And so you might a priori think that Nashua, New Hampshire is going to be more similar to Providence, Rhode Island. Nashua, New Hampshire is the second largest city in northern New England. But it turns out from this view, It actually looks a lot more like North Berwick, which has a population of about 5,000. Looks more like that than it does like Providence, which has a population of about 1.7 million. And so this is just an example of the kinds of power that we can extract from this data tool and help communities collaborate toward sustainable policy. So once again, my name is Caleb Hill. I was supervised this summer by Dovev Levine and Gina Khan, and I worked for the New England Municipal Sustainability Network. Thanks for your time.